A prerequisite to be a sponsor on the Behind the Shield podcast is you have to bring a solution to one of our problems. And today's sponsor, Ease Alert, does exactly that. Founded by the son of a firefighter, Blake Richardson watched the impact of sleep deprivation on his father's health and decided to use modern technology to address that problem. As you've probably heard me mention many times, it is pure insanity that we wake an entire fire station for one crew to respond. And the way that we're alerted makes the firefighter's stress go from 0 to 100. Now, Ease Alert has a host of solutions, the first of which is the wearable TAC pod, which alerts the first responder of an incoming call through vibration in the wrist. So as you can imagine, in a communal bunk room, only the crews that need to respond will be woken up. Now, they also have the bunk alert system, which puts vibration into the bunk itself. There's LED lighting, a turnout timer, station automation where you can program bay doors to close or gas stoves to turn off. And understanding that sleep deprivation is behind so many things that ail us, a recent study showed that Ease Alert improves health impacts by 169%. So if you want to hear more about Ease Alert, you can listen to my conversation with Blake on episode 1168 of the Behind the Shield podcast, or go to easealert.com. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show Lisa Mason. Now, Lisa is a career accountant, but she is also the sister of John Little, an 18-year Canadian Armed Forces veteran who took his life on November 22nd, 2021. So we discuss a host of topics, from her early family dynamic, women in wrestling, her journey into accounting, John's journey into the military, his own powerful mental health story, navigating grief, the creation of Operation Talk to Me Johnny, investing proactively into our nation's health, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of almost 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Lisa Mason. Enjoy. Well, Lisa, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this afternoon?
I'm just outside Toronto in Ontario, Canada. So.
All right. Well, I would love to start at the very beginning of your timeline. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born here in Ontario, little town called Wallaceburg. Most people don't know it. And I was the oldest of 3 to my parents, John and Sharon. And we were close. We were always, my mom used to joke that we could live in a refrigerator box and be perfectly fine because we were always around each other. My brothers and I, always got along pretty well. We stayed close well into our adulthood, and it was really important to my parents that be the case, and they really made sure that they instilled that in us from an early age. So, my brothers were always my best friends growing up. We grew up just outside Sarnia. We moved to a small hobby farm there. And dad was a truck driver, mom stayed at home, and until we were a little bit older. And so, we grew up working on farms and spending a lot of time outside, dirt bikes and go-karts and all sorts of things like that. So that's, just a good old rural growing up.
Hmm.
So
I grew up on a farm as well, so I can relate. What about sports? What were you doing on that side?
yeah, I played, intramural in like through the schools a bit, and then wrestled in high school. My brothers were more into hockey and soccer. That was never really my jam. I worked and did things. I was the responsible older sister all the time, and so they kind of had a little bit more fun and played sports a bit more and things like that. But I did some wrestling and a few other things.
When I think of women wrestling, a lot of times I think of the stories where the amazing female wrestlers end up training with a lot of the male wrestlers just because of the numbers. Was that something that you did too?
I was really fortunate because our school had an excellent female wrestling program. It was one of the largest in southwestern Ontario from a numbers perspective. So it was really good because we had women in most weight classes who were really able to sort of share information with each other. And wrestling for women is a bit different than for men, right? And the way that we ground ourselves to the mat and things is completely different from the way men do. So it was really interesting to be able to share those sorts of pieces of information. But certainly, we were close with all the males on the team, and they were always very supportive and helpful. So it was nice because there was that mixed sort of practices that were happening, and we were really able to share a lot of knowledge with each other. So it was good. And then, of course, I had two younger brothers to practice on, so that that was always helpful.
What are the differences? Like, educate me as far as the technical side. You're talking about the different way that you're grounding or pinning. What are the differences between the male and wrestling?
Yeah, so it's more about how we hold ourselves individually, right? Like the way that women sort of stand and are postured generally in comparison to men changes that center of gravity for you. And so the way that you do, the lifts to get them down, or the way that you throw your shoulder in can sometimes change a little bit. And I mean, I'm an amateur. I wrestled in high school. I'm no expert on it, but there are differences in the way that you sort of have to approach things, and then mindset too, I think, is a little bit different, right? Men are grow up being sort of tough and rumble, and so when you enter a ring like that for a woman, it's getting the right mindset is really interesting because we're taught to be prim and proper, and next thing you know, you're in this singlet sweating and like wrestling this other woman to the ground. And I think it's so interesting because as a woman, for me in particular, there's that thought of, oh my God, like, I hope I don't hurt her, but also I want to win. And I don't know if that comes across for men the same way that it might for, a more compassionate woman. And so I think it's interesting, just sort of the dynamic and how you approach the match and how you approach certain movements, because they will change if you're wrestling a man versus if you're wrestling a woman.
I think you see that even if you watch, MMA, the UFC, and some of the other organizations, there is a different vibe to the female athletes, and I feel, that when I had some of the martial arts coaches on, they talked about, like Greg Jackson, for example, talked about you have the martial artists and you have the fighters, and the fighters, a lot of times have come off the streets, so they probably are the ones that aren't afraid to injure the opponent. And you have the martial artists that are the ones that you see, could have broken an arm but didn't, and turn to the ref and say, hey, he's tapping, come on. But I think you see
Yeah.
that more so in the female the female firefighter. Oh my goodness. The female fighters. God, I need more coffee.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, we saw that great boxing match a couple of weeks ago between that American fighter whose name is escaping me right now, and the Canadian just before the Jake Paul and Anthony Joshua fight. And I thought it was really impressive the way that they went out and they did the full 3-minute rounds and things like that. But it does change a lot about the way that you approach the fight, and that's why I think it's really interesting for women who, haven't maybe trained in that way or haven't really experienced sort of the more male dominated sports to be kind of watching some of these things and seeing it a little bit more mainstream. Like I never knew how long 3 minutes was until I wrestled.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, oh my God, I'm only a minute and a half in. Like, and so I think, it's a really interesting concept that, time and sports like boxing or wrestling or anything like that, where it's sort of that one-on-one combat type of scenario that's, high intensity, lots of cardio, but also a lot of strategy and thinking and trying to make sure that you're in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, is so fascinating because the mind can do some incredible tricks in 3 minutes.
It's been amazing to watch as well, the evolution of, I guess, the popularity of some of the female combat sports, because you hear this term toxic masculinity, and I think that's misused most of the time. But there is that element of, my generation's upbringing that, the boys do this and the girls do that. They wear pretty dresses and we go to war or whatever the thing is. And you're seeing a complete blurring of the lines. And I think that we need more of the gentle feminine side in the messaging on the male side. And then conversely, it's great seeing whatever it is, whether it's female firefighters and cops or soldiers, or whether it's fighters or, whatever that perspective that is different than the traditional female role, I think is so empowering on the female side as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I love seeing, there's nothing better to me than going into a hospital and seeing a male nurse. Or, listening to my nephews talk about wanting to be, in healthcare or do something, more sort of traditionally female. And hopefully my niece will grow up one day and tell me that she's going to be an MMA fighter. I don't know. Hopefully not, actually, because that would just scare me. But I've seen wrestling matches go wrong, but I think that I think it's really fascinating how the lines have blurred and what it's actually doing for our understanding of the opposite sex.
100%. Well, what about career aspirations? What were you dreaming of becoming when you were in the high school age?
Yeah, I mean, I was boring. Again, that responsible older sister thing always came into play, right? So from a very young age, I kind of knew that I was going to be an accountant. And, Dad used to tease me and say, go be an accountant so that you can help me screw over the government. And now that I've been an accountant for 20 years, he's very disappointed that I've not helped him screw over the government. But no, I knew from probably grade 10 that I was going to be an accountant, and that's what I've done. I've gone on to get my CPA designation and am a CFO. So
brilliant. Well, I want to kind of explore some of your work in healthcare as we get a little bit further in. But before, while we're still in early life, what about John? Was he always thinking of the military, or was there something else when he was younger?
Yeah, I mean, John was always one for the rules, right? Hated authority, so the military seems a little counterintuitive, but was always one for the rules. I can remember a story, and my parents love to tell this one often, but there was some sort of fight or something on the playground at school. I think John was in grade 4 or 5, maybe, and the whatever teacher was on duty that day didn't see it. And so, this older, bigger kid was picking on this younger, smaller kid, and John went over and basically fought him and put him in his place, sort of thing. And so he actually got sent to the principal's office for standing up to this bully and helping this smaller child. And so he's like, how does this make any sense? Like, I did the right thing here, and now I'm getting in trouble for it. And so the principal's trying to explain to him that he's not allowed to be, quote, the playground cop, and had threatened to call dad. And he was like, good, do it, call dad, because he's gonna be like good for my boy. Like, I'm glad that he stood up for this other kid and whatever. That was always who John was. He'd give the shirt off his back to just about anybody. But if you wronged him, you knew it. And he liked people who played within the rules. It was pretty black and white with him. There was very few gray areas. And that's just sort of who he always was. So, when he started talking about the military in grade 4, after hearing from a soldier who had been a POW in Bosnia, it was not really a surprise to any of us that was going to be kind of the path that he went on. And, 18, finished high school and was kind of sitting on mom and dad's couch. And dad's like, get a job or join the army, but you're not just going to sit here all summer and do nothing. And so he went that August, wrote his exams, and, was inducted in December of that year. So
when you look back now with this kind of veteran lens that you have, understanding that a lot of us that put on a uniform had some struggles when we were younger. And the sad thing is, if some of those struggles were left unaddressed, they became a fractured foundation as we progress through these professions that do see a lot of trauma and receive a lot of trauma physically. Were there any elements that you're aware of his younger years that you think contributed to struggles later on?
I don't think so. I mean, John was a smaller in stature kind of guy. And it's actually widely talked about that he was a pretty small guy for the army. And so he was bullied a bit in school because of that, right? He was one of the smallest guys in his year. Certainly through high school, you get into like much bigger guys in grade 12 compared to him as a small grade 9. And so there was a bit of bullying and things that happened, but John made friends pretty quickly. People knew where he stood. So I think a lot of people had a lot of respect for him. And he never really had small man mentality. But he did have a bit of a chip on his shoulder. And I think, dad being a truck driver and long haul for quite a number of years while we were kids, John was always sort of the man of the house, right? From a very young age. And I think that he really took that role to heart. And that led him also, through his military career days. And I think, sort of having that maybe self-imposed stress of like, I have to protect everybody, probably played some role in a few things, but ultimately, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure a bit more, James, but, as I go back over the days and weeks and months leading up to John's last day, I can't find anything that really points to a why, and that's always sort of been the hardest part.
I know with a lot of people that we lose, when they look back and from a psychological point of view, there don't seem to be any obvious markers, then the TBI element, it seems to factor in. Did he get any big hits prior to even entering the military in ice hockey or anything else?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I had two brothers who were 2 years apart. They were constantly hitting each other over the head. Yeah, I think definitely, like, certainly there was a few concussions and everything growing up. You fall out of a hayloft because you were not paying attention to what you were doing, or whatever the case, right? Get bucked off a horse, those types of things. We certainly saw all of those, like we grew up in the 80s, so
yeah, those memes are real.
Helmets on bikes weren't a thing. Yeah, like
Well, then walk me through his journey into the military. You've got this young boy, physically smaller. And again, I can relate. I had my growth spurt when I was 18. So I was the smallest kid all through school, pretty much. So what was that kind of on-ramp experience for him? And let's talk about where he was first deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, he joined at 18. He did his basic training in Saint-Jean, Quebec, which, it's grueling. It's meant to be grueling. That's what it's for. But was pretty quickly posted to Edmonton with the PPCLI up here, and he loved it. Like, he was a really regimental guy. So had a ton of respect for the regiment, really loved everybody that he worked with, really was not a fan of the institution of the military, but a really, proud regimental soldier. Um, and quickly got involved. I mean, there's all sorts of things that different stories that we could go down with, different training issues and things like that. But similar to anything back in those days, there was some, a bit of bullying when you sort of first came in, and some hazing maybe that happened. But overall, he really took to regimental life and, the brotherhood that is the military and sisterhood. And so Edmonton, he loved it out there. I mean, close to the mountains, what's not to like, minus the snow and the minus 40-degree weather. But he really enjoyed it. He had an opportunity to continue to be creative out there, coming up with logos and painting murals on the side of buildings for each of the units out there. And, I think to some degree he was really built for military life. He liked to be outdoors. He liked to do training. He liked to kind of stay busy with those types of things. And so he started driving the LAV 3 when he first got deployed. That's what he was doing. So he was deployed in rotation 108 to Afghanistan. I know less about that first deployment than I do about the second. And I imagine that's by design somewhere. But so he was driving the LAV, was involved in a few cleanup crews. So I think that really was troublesome a few times. And, he had a couple of friends die on that tour, and not necessarily with him, but stationed, in forward operating bases. And when he came back, I could tell immediately that something wasn't quite right. We had gone to a concert. He'd come home for a visit, and him and I went to a concert. And it was a big, like, waterfront music festival in our hometown. And at the end of he'd gotten really drunk really fast, and to the point where he had caught the cop's eyes as we were about to leave. And I was like, don't worry, boys, I got this. I'm the older sister. I'm getting him out of here. And so they were fine with that. They let me get him out of there and with no issue. But as we were walking away, somebody had lit off fireworks and he hit the dirt. And I was like, what the hell are you doing? And it didn't really occur to me, because as a civilian, you don't think about bombs dropping from the air. Like, it's not something that we are, have to deal with here in North America and in most countries, thankfully. But, it was really odd behavior. And I was like, so I trying to talk to him. And of course, at that point in the evening, there was not much point. And so I got him home and I took him out for lunch the next day. And I was like, okay, you're not all right. Like, as your big sister, I'm telling you that you are not okay, and we have to get you help, and this is what we're going to do about it. And he was like, no. I was like, okay. And he's like, I'm going to go back. And I was like, no, you can't go back. Are you insane? Like, you're already broken. Like, we need to fix you first before you can go back. And so, he basically said to me, like, go ahead and call the Padre then, if that's what you want to do. But I know what to say so that they let me go back. And I was like, well, that's not going to be very useful for me then, is it? And so ultimately, we just had a heart-to-heart about all of the things. And I just told him to take care of himself. And so he went back on rotation 309. And for that rotation, he was at a forward operating base. And they were part of the Salavat mission. And so there was a Legion magazine writer by the name of Adam Day who was stationed with them at the time. So we actually have a number of articles that were written by Adam where John, has little quips or quotes. And if you read them, they're quite funny, because John was always the one to make everybody laugh, even in sort of the darkest of moments. And so, they'd be sitting there, and some commanding officer would tell them what they're going to be up to that day. And then he would basically make a joke about how it wasn't going to work because the townspeople didn't trust them yet. And, like with this whole story and everything. And I think because of that dark humor, people just really saw themselves in John. And so they sort of gravitated and connected with him well. But yeah, and then when he got back, he had a full drinking problem shortly after he got back, and got into a DUI and ended up having to go to rehab. And mostly the rehab was for the PTSD, but also for the drinking. And so he was able to come off the alcohol, which was good. But the PTSD just kind of stuck around. And unfortunately, he had told them that he wasn't ready to go back yet. But his window was up and he was going back. So that's what happened. He rejoined the base. And while he was in Edmonton, he was doing really well. But then he transferred here to Ontario, and to a reserve base that he was sort of overseeing or helping to oversee. And because it was less structured, and, fewer guys and things like that, I think that's when, he started to have a few troubles and didn't feel as connected to some of the brotherhood, and, some of the other people that he served with. And then it was 5 years or so after that he passed.
Firstly, going all the way back to when you first noticed there was something wrong after the fireworks incident, what year was that?
Yeah, so that would have been 2000, summer of 2009.
Okay, so we weren't really having a very strong mental health conversation back then. So had that happened 10 years later, it might have gone differently.
May have, may not have. Yeah. He still would have known what to say. But, I can hope that, 10 years later, 15 years later now, that it certainly would have been a different conversation and there would have been more avenues. But I think sometimes the sense of duty with these guys, and some of the leadership at some of these organizations, it encouraged still that stiff upper lip and that sense of duty. And so it's, sacrifice oneself to save your friends. And certainly that's the mentality that most people go into these jobs with, to some degree, unless they've got a hero complex. But, and we know there's a few of those. But generally, it's you sort of go into these professions with good intentions of like, I want to make the world a better place and this is how I'm going to do it. And so I think sometimes that sense of duty can get in the way of self-care.
It's interesting, the evolution of my simple understanding of all this from all the people I got to talk to, from Gold Star families to psychologists and everyone in between. And you look at, the beginning of the conversations, it was PTSD and we're broken and disorders and all this thing. And then it's kind of evolved. And now what's interesting is you can actually tap into that very element of service to encourage people to go and seek help. Because if you look at it as a performance issue rather than a broken issue, it reframes it completely. So if someone had, been able to have that kind of thought back then with John and be like, hey, I want you to go back to Afghanistan when you are ready to perform at the highest level so that you don't put yourself in danger, don't put your men in danger, men and women. So let's do some work so we can optimize you again. And I think if we had that kind of conversation, a lot of military members, police, fire, etc., would actually take a step back and go, okay, well, this is for the betterment of everyone. Okay, I will sacrifice myself by not deploying so I can work on myself, get to where I'm optimizing, working at an optimal level, and then go and rejoin, my fire station, whatever it is, rather than, hey, you're broken, you need to go get fixed, which is a terrible negative connotation to it, in which case we just shove it down and be like, no, I'll be fine. But we aren't operating at a high level. We are depleted. So shifting from some sort of kind of rehabilitation to encouraging performance, you have this same exact journey, but under a completely different pretense.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting concept because, I mean, look, I used the word broken with John back in 2009, and back in those days, that's what it was. You were broken. And even as shortly ago as 2018 or 2019, when I was talking with him and encouraging him to get help and whatever, I now see that the way that I approached the conversation was more about him not being right as opposed to him not being his best self. And, I got a lot of pushback from him in those days. It didn't help him in encouraging him to get to where he needed to be. And unfortunately, by the time he realized what he needed, it was too late. But I think, look, and I say this to a lot of people, breaking the stigma is going to be an extremely difficult thing to do in our lifetime. In my nephew's lifetime, maybe it's a possibility that in their lifetime, we can break the stigma around mental health. But in our lifetime, it's going to be a really big challenge. But I think small things like reframing the conversation, particularly as it relates to mental wellness for PSP, and how we look at it from a performance perspective as opposed to a mental illness perspective, really changes the conversation completely, not only for the individual experiencing the symptoms, but also for the leadership who need to support them through it.
Absolutely. Another thing that you alluded to is when he came back, he was drinking heavily, and I'm assuming that was contrary to how he was pre-military. You hear this a lot in the fire service where, you get these people 10, 15, 20 years into their career, and now they're getting DUIs, and maybe there's, even a domestic incident, whatever it is. And they always ask people, well, what are they like? What were they like when they got hired? Oh, they were amazing. They were so fired up. It's like, well, there we go. So a large portion of the behavioral change is coming from the profession. But you have these people, then they start, falling off the rails a little bit, and then like, oh, we've got to get rid of them. Rather than, okay, well, we did this to them. So what can we do to envelop them and help them heal and get them back? Because the goal is not medical retirement. That's a horrible outcome, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
The goal is to get them back on their feet so they can finish their full service, be mentally sound, physically sound, and have a healthy retirement. So having compassion and empathy for people that are going through some things, even if they are causing trouble, even breaking laws, if they were a good member of, whatever tribe you belong to at the beginning, then you've got to give them every opportunity to kind of get back on track again. You can't just discard them the moment the wheels fall off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that's one of the things that I think John felt in his last days. He was in the transition unit. He was going to be medically released 13 months post his death date, had he continued to be alive. And he was really struggling, and we knew it from conversations, but as we went through, different paperwork, and John was a writer. He wrote poems and songs and short essays, like anything. Like he just wrote all the time. So if you could read his handwriting, which was atrocious, by the way,
so is mine.
then you really got, some pretty good insights into how he was thinking and feeling, and those types of things. And so, as I sat there going through every piece of paper that he had in his house, because you didn't dare throw anything out, because it might be a utility bill on the front, but on the back there was a whole poem. And so you couldn't just you had to flip everything over and look at it. But as we sat there and cleared out his house and, went through some of these pieces of paper to figure out what might be salvageable and, something that his kids might want later on, or that my parents might want to keep or whatever, you're reading these things, and it became so much clearer, what it was that he was feeling about, what do I do now? he would have been 37 years old, 37-ish years old when he retired. That's young. He had kids that he had to pay child support for, and and all the things. And so he still needed to work, but his back was done, his knees were completely shot, and his brain was fighting him every day of his life. And so, what do you do next? You have few transferable skills coming from the military, and the ones that do transfer typically transfer to police operations, but with his back and his knees, there was no chance. So now what? And I think that really was weighing on him, as he worked to do a few other things financially as a result of his divorce. And it's just had a moment where the mind was bigger than anything else.
When people were talking about suicide, 10 plus years ago, that's even more recently, but certainly then, there was this conversation of it was cowardly, it was selfish. How could you think of your family? And I've had this kind of metamorphosis of understanding, listening to people that were there, some who went through with their attempt and survived, many who were right there and whatever it was stopped them. And there's almost every single one has the same common denominator, but you don't really hear it discussed front and center in this mental health conversation. When you look at the human being, we are wired to survive. We are wired to, to reproduce, to protect our children, et cetera, et cetera. But when you listen to the voices of these men and women through the perfect storm of multiple elements, from unaddressed childhood trauma, sleep deprivation, TBIs, again, financial relationships, all these compounding, there becomes a miswiring where their reality is shifted. And now they truly believe that they are the reason for the pain of their loved ones. And if they just remove themselves, which in that distorted mind, I would argue is actually selfless and courageous, then the pain will go away for everyone else. Now, shift to a healthy mind, of course, that makes no sense. But in that psychosis, over and over and over again, if that's your true belief system at that moment, and you have, access to whatever, like a lot of our law enforcement, for example, the means for that, and then you throw in alcohol, which distorts it even more, you've then got the perfect storm for a suicide. You have an interesting lens because you have all this that he's written as well. Were there any elements of that feeling of being a burden prior to his suicide?
Yeah, I think so. And, I think one of the things that he worried about was how he was going to take care of his children. And he was financially, from a pure financial standpoint, in his mind, I believe he felt that there was only one way to make sure that his children were taken care of. And that was through his life insurance. And, I don't know, and I will never know if that entered into his mind that night or not. But I know that he had been dealing with some financial issues that were scary. As a result of his divorce, he was trying to, get the mortgage for the home that he had lived in for almost 6 years in his own name, now that the divorce had been finalized. But as a result, he had to do that and get his ex-wife's name off of it. And there was some pushing from her lawyer's side to get that done yesterday. And unfortunately, child support counts against you as a debt. And so now they were saying, well, you don't make enough money to have the mortgage, even though he'd been paying the mortgage for 6 years and the child support. And there was a really real possibility in his mind that he was going to be homeless. Now, my family would never have let that happen, but and we had already spoken with him about ways that we could get around it. And on that Friday before he passed, he finally found out that he was able to get the mortgage and that everything was signed off and he was good to go. And he was elated. I hadn't seen him that happy in, I don't even remember how long, because it was just one blow after the other that he felt like he was going through. And so I spoke with him that Friday. He was over the moon happy to finally have that behind him, and, was looking forward to a couple of things that were coming up. And then on the Monday night, we got the call, and I have no idea how we went from total elation and relief and everything else to death 72 hours later. And it wasn't until I did the mental health first aid for veterans course about 15 months ago now, and that I understood that these big highs are just as concerning as these big lows. And so now, like, I look back on it and I was like, oh, that was supposed to be a red flag. But what, I was just relieved because I didn't have to worry anymore that, he was going to do something silly, because everything was finally working out in his favor. And that wasn't the case. So, but I agree with you. I think that in that moment, I've debated with people, is it a decision or is it an action that just happens, that you're sort of unable to stop yourself because of the programming that is happening now in your head. And so, I use the word decision. I don't necessarily mean that it was some, master thought out plan. I just use it because I don't think anybody has a better word for it these days. But, I think that in that moment, making that decision, and believe me, in the days afterwards, I was like, you little SOB, how could you do this to us? And I still have days like that. How could you be this selfish? Why would you do this to us? Those types of things. But I also have a deep understanding of the fact that he thought he was protecting the rest of us. And it's why one of the messages that I say when I do public speaking now is, that pain that you are feeling doesn't go away when you pass. It gets broken up and it gets given to all of your loved ones. And so if that's what your mind is telling you is going to happen, is that you're going to pass and all of this pain is going to go away, and it's going to be better for everyone because now you're not going to be this burden, it's not the case. You are giving that pain now away.
I just feel like that should be front and center in this conversation. There seems to be two, things that you hear simultaneously. I want the suffering to end, whatever that is, the emotional turmoil, the physical pain, et cetera, et cetera. But then that feeling of burdensome, I'm now mentally injured, physically injured. My family's got to take care of me. I can't earn the money I used to be able to. I only see my kids half the time, whatever it is. It's just compounding. And that needs to be out there, because I feel like the red flag for friends, family, and the individual is the moment that you even hear that little voice start to say, it's your fault. You're the reason. That's your red flag. These, hey, if you're struggling, reach out, call me. Here's the number. I've got an open door policy. Bullshit. If you are starting to believe that you are the burden, that you are the reason for people's pain, there's your red flag. And I think that, because I've had people on the show that, that was really the big scary thing for them. I've had people reach out, listening to interviews, saying the same thing. If you could just get to that point, I don't think you're as close to crisis then. The moment you're in crisis, you're not picking up a phone. That's a universally accepted thing. It's too late by that point. So if we
Absolutely.
can see that starting to happen and that coming up in verbiage and conversation, how many more people could we save getting them a little bit earlier?
Oh, without a doubt. And that's why I think a lot of people have gravitated to, Operation Talk to Me Johnny's message. Is it really bites back at that belief that some people might have that they are the problem and that their family is going to be better off without them. And, I joke with people a lot that I'm just a woman who got on the internet one day and cried and did 22 push-ups, and now I have 537 followers or whatever it is. But the reality is, people I've had people reach out to me and be like, your story is so unique in a community where we're all trying to save each other, but nobody's really talking about what happens to the families after the fact. And so, when I'm able to post, videos of my nephews doing planks or push-ups for some challenge, or whatever in memory of their dad, people are like, oh, shit. Like, or I tell stories about, how I'm feeling that day and what his loss is doing to me, um, or, whatever, right? And people have been like, like you saved my life because of you, and your story, I've realized X. Um, or, the number of people who are like, thank God, I was close. I had the gun in hand and I was walking out the back door. But I thought of, my loved ones. And at the end of the day, I couldn't do it. And so if our story can be out there loudly enough to give that person even just 1 second of doubt about what they're burdensome to their family or their friends, then I think it's possible to save lives. And I have to believe that. And that's what keeps me going every day. And I think if we can get more people talking about how, it's not burdensome to talk, and to listen to each other, then I think, we've got a lot better chance, because the reality is, you're absolutely right. John didn't call anybody. Nobody knew what was happening that night. His fiance was in the other room. And had it not been for the fact that his music just stopped, she wouldn't have even known anything happened. But his music ended and it didn't start back up again like it normally would. And she went to investigate. And for whatever reason, he made that choice. His mind took over. I don't know. But he could not get past the fact that he needed to do what he did.
I think speaking of the families, there's also a lot of value when we finally understand all these contributing factors, multiple, that take these people to this place. And then you start to understand what that broken mind looks like from the inside. And I'm use that term broken very compassionately, because then I think you're not left with that guilt and shame of, oh, they were a coward. They just said they just wanted to be, just leave it to us. That's not what it seems to be at all. It's the opposite. Like we said, there was that belief that was a solution for most of them. So then I hope that it offers some peace to some of these families as well, to go, okay, that wasn't what my loved one was thinking. They weren't just saying, screw my family, I'm going to leave them with all this pain. They thought they were fixing it. But, as we all know, when we drink and drive, when, you do have a concussion, you can't think clearly. There's a reason why it's called altered mindset. And it's the same with this. So I hope even people that it's too late, that they've lost that loved one, can look back retrospectively and put some more compassion and empathy into that, that scenario, and hopefully forgive that loved one for what happened.
Yeah, I hope so too. As I said earlier, I definitely still struggle with anger. That's my number one emotion, when it comes to John's death. And is it all angry at him? No, not necessarily. I actually have I believe, a true understanding of what he thought he may have been accomplishing, in doing what he did. And to some degree, I think he actually probably accomplished it. So, it's hard for me to say that, he was wrong in that moment or anything like that. Certainly I would have found better ways to do it. But what happened, and you can't change that. And I think being angry about it is, it's an easy emotion for me because it comes innately, as part of the thought process around it, and how upset I am that he's not here to help me with different things. I mean, our parents are getting older, whatever, right? I've got big life choices that I'm making, and he was always my sounding board, and now he's not here. And so, there's anger that gets involved in that. Whereas my mom has no anger at all. Anger has never been an emotion that my mom's felt as it related to my brother's death. And I think that is so interesting because, it's hard for me to understand how a mother couldn't be, so angry with their child for doing this. And I think that it really goes to the fact that, we all know John. We know what it is that we think he was trying to accomplish. And we know that he would never have done this in some sort of selfish means. And I think if you can really get to the crux of who your person was, as a person, to you, not to their military or their police or their fire organization, but who they were as your brother or your sister or your, son or daughter or mom or dad or, whatever, who they were to you, then you're going to have a much easier time of finding some understanding and some forgiveness there. And that took me longer than I'd like to say openly on this podcast. But it took me longer than I would have hoped. But I did eventually sort of get there with that.
When you were talking, it's funny, when we're talking about analogies, I think a recent glaring example of what happens to an overstressed, maybe even underslept mind is what happened in COVID. I mean, when that first came out, think about how that tore friendships and families apart. Are you pro-mask or anti-mask or pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine or, whatever the thing is? I mean, it was a full-on Flanders Field World War I trench warfare and no ability to stand in the middle and critically think like, oh, well, this is definitely a real thing, but the health of the people is a big factor as well. Okay, that's common sense. That's like good critical thinking. But the moment people are overstressed, underslept, and you add all these other things that create this, tornado in their mind, their ability to just stand in the middle and think about it goes away. And most people weren't suicidal during COVID, but I mean, that was a great social experiment. What happens when a mind is tormented? Your ability to think clearly and critically is diminished.
Yeah, now we are seeing a number of mental health cases come out of COVID.
Oh, yeah.
You still see people who are completely terrified now of going outside and because of COVID. And so there is a trauma, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens, particularly in the next 5 years around any studies that are done about this, because, I believe that there are people who were truly traumatized by some of the things that happened, particularly up here in Canada, where we had some really rigid rules. Did Florida even shut down?
we did. Actually, I'm not a fan of all of DeSantis's things. I'll be very honest, but I have to give him credit in his administration. We shut down like everyone else. Who took it seriously by anyone else. And funny enough, we probably have the highest concentration of elderly of anywhere in the country. And yet they slowly opened the tap. So it was, I think, restaurants first and then gyms followed after that. And again, there was, 6 feet and all the ridiculousness, but we were open, and it did. So people were communing again. They were out in the sunshine again. And lo and behold, if I'm not mistaken, we had one of the lowest death rates of anywhere in the nation. But we were vilified by a lot of the, Californias and New Yorks, et cetera. So we did. We took it seriously, but we kind of followed more like the Swedish model. And it was to great success because now we know that if you want to keep people healthy during a pandemic, to tell them to stay indoors, don't see your friends and family, get fast food and alcohol delivered to your house and binge watch Tiger King is not great wellness advice during a pandemic. So maybe do the exact opposite next time and you're going to have a much better health outcome.
Oh, Tiger King. I forgot about that. Yeah. No wonder we were all traumatized during COVID.
Exactly. Our dumpster fire didn't seem as bad when you watch someone else's dumpster fire. That was the thing.
Right. That's right. But yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with some of the studies that come out, because I do believe that particularly in some of the more lockdown nations, or more stringent ruled nations, that there was actual trauma that people, you know, have because of being locked inside, or, that fear mongering that happened. And I don't care if you got vaccinated or not. I did. I had elderly parents and a father-in-law who was battling dementia, and we needed it to be able to get into, long-term care, and we needed it to get out of the country. So I was like, I'm getting out of here. I don't care. Poke me. Like, I drink and, whatever else. So if I'm not going to take care of myself that way, well, then what's this thing going to do? Who cares? But I know a lot of people who wouldn't put it in their bodies, and good for them. But I think the way that the media and well, the media basically, pinned people against each other in terms of vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. I don't understand that sort of mentality, because at the end of the day, you're just doing what's best for yourself and your family. And I think that if people can't understand that, and we can't support each other in that, then, society's come a long way in the opposite direction of where we needed to be. So it'll be interesting for me to see what comes out of some of the statistics around mental health numbers over the next few years, and particularly for children. That, we're in sort of those primary levels of school during COVID, and what that does to both their social skills, but also their mental health.
I know. I mean, I've had so many conversations with people about this. I try and, keep revisiting it, because when we came out with COVID, people were like, oh, we don't want to talk about it anymore. Like, well, wait a second. You don't want to learn from what went right and what went wrong, so that when this virus comes again, whatever we call it next time, Sebastian or whatever the phrases of the day, that's murdering a bunch of people because they're still sick, because we haven't addressed obesity and the mental health crisis and the opioid epidemic and all these other things. We're not going to learn any lessons from it. But I mean, when you reflect back now, you speak to a lot of the people, especially that work with children. Schools were where most of the domestic abuse and sexual abuse is reported by children. And we took that away for a year and a half in a lot of areas. You've got these poor kids that graduated right when it hit, that were then given stimulus checks and then shamed to the moment that ended. Like, why aren't you working? And we cut their legs from them. How can we integrated from school into, there was no middle ground, no cliff. We just went from school to first jobs to you working your way. They went from school to a year of handouts, and then you're expected to get back up into the workforce. So we have to take responsibility of, again, what was done right. I can't really think of many at the moment, and then what was done poorly. And addressing, for example, the American obesity crisis should have been front and center, because we know that pre-existing conditions were the massive amplifier of whether you were going to survive or die from COVID. So this whole trust the science, we care about people. Well, if you did, Americans would be getting healthier and healthier, but that's not the case. So unless we turn around and actually revisit with these conversations, the physical health, and in this case, the mental health, we're just going to, it's going to be even worse the next time.
Yeah. And I think, COVID brought about, I mean, John obviously died during COVID. He died in 2021. And it, to some degree, has a place of blame in his story. And I think it's a really interesting piece of blame, because what had happened was John finally did start to seek help. He was seeing a social worker on the base, and was getting help that way, and was doing quite well. And then this individual during COVID needed to step back for their own personal reasons. And so the base was then had a vacancy in their social worker slot, and they only had one. So when this individual went off, and I don't blame him at all, but when this individual went off, there was nobody for John to see. And except for, the doctor, but that she's a doctor, she doesn't do mental health. And so he had tried to get in to see a mental health professional outside of the base. But, the military lost the paperwork a couple times. Everybody's experienced that one. And I don't mean to joke about it, but it's a bit of an epidemic over there in terms of lost paperwork. And unfortunately, he was unable to get into help in a timely enough fashion. So I don't know what it's like in the US or when it comes to police or fire, but when a active military member dies here in Canada, they do what's called a board of inquiry. And the board of inquiry basically goes in, they interview family, friends, colleagues, commanding officers, whatever, and basically look into, is there anything that could have been done to essentially save this person, either from the accident that happened or the suicide or, the combat situation, whatever it is. And so generally speaking, it's a great idea. It's an excellent tool as long as it's being used properly. And so they went in, they did this investigation. They came back to us a year and a half later. I can't remember. It seemed like forever. And said, okay, so, he was doing really well while he was talking to this social worker, but then the social worker had to go off because of COVID and, whatever personal reasons that related to that. And he couldn't get in to see anybody. And, the referrals basically went nowhere. And so, yep, we think that there's a gap, not legally or anything, but, we're taking responsibility for that basically, right? There's a gap in our system and we know we need to fix it. I was like, okay, great. So I was like, so what's the recommendation? And they're like, well, we're going to recommend that the base always have two social workers. And that way, if somebody has to go off, the other person can sort of, shift their schedule around to make sure that they've got room to at least be able to touch base and sort of keep treatment going. I was like, great. When is this being implemented? They're like, oh, we don't know. It'll all depend on budgets and whether or not they can actually afford a second social worker. I was like, what? like, I'm like, you have to be kidding me. Like, you know that this is a problem. You know that this will potentially fix the problem, but you don't know if you're going to do it. Like, how much did you spend on my brother's funeral and moving and his life insurance and this payment and that payment and whatever? Like, it's got to be worth the social worker. But I think, because of the way that COVID hit, and John was at home because he was in the transition unit, so he wasn't training every day. So he was at home alone and, puttering around. I mean, his fiance was there in the evenings, but she worked. So he was home most of the day by himself, working on his models or writing a poem or, playing his guitar or whatever. But really not being the normal, productive individual that he typically would have been. And then on top of that, he loses this social worker because of COVID related reasons. And so, things just sort of compounded from there. And I can't help but, put some blame there to say like, that it certainly didn't help the situation. But it's interesting to me where else we might see sort of that compounding situation and whether or not we can actually make it better going forward.
Well, even again, my white belt perspective, having learned from so many of these people that come on the show, you look at obviously the trauma that he saw during combat. I'm assuming there was probably some exposure to some sort of TBI. If not, then again, the ice hockey before. You've got that loss of tribe when he leaves, the men and women that he was serving alongside. You've got that, perceived loss of purpose as he's thinking about transitioning out. Well, what am I going to do next? You've got the financial strain. You've got the relationship strain. Then you add in COVID. So now you've got isolation. Then you remove the social worker. And now here we are, that perfect storm that we talked about. And I'm not saying it's that clear cut, but if you're thinking about, the algorithm that someone's going to be more likely to be in crisis, you're seeing these pieces. And so if a ding dong podcaster can, see this, then like you said, something as big as the Canadian military or US military or, the US fire service, we should be able to put these pieces and go, okay, well, this is someone we really need to take, to keep an eye on. We've got alcoholism, we've got all these other things that are factored in. And so, yeah, I mean, that definitely sounds like that was something that was missed. And going to what you're talking about as far as the response that you got, and this mirrors, I would say, your work in accounting on the healthcare side too. If there's one term that summarizes most of the issues that I've seen everywhere, it's false economy. That people will spend so much money downstream rather than just invest at the beginning. And the fire service is a perfect example. They are bleeding millions of dollars on overtime that's filling vacancies for a recruitment crisis, from retention crisis, which is coming from the fact that they don't take care of their people, and young people are deterred by that. And then you add in, obviously, the mental health, the physical health, all the injuries, the line of duty deaths, the disability payments, the lawsuits from mistakes that we make. I mean, it's just millions and millions and millions. And I don't understand why these financial gurus of these establishments aren't going and saying, well, hey, if we put in a second, healthcare worker, social worker, that would help us save millions and millions. Instead, we seem to let everyone die first and then go, oh, maybe we should fix that. And I don't understand why there's not more proactive thinking in these organizations.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, it's funny because I did bring that up with a regimental sergeant major up here. And he's retired now, but at the time, he was involved to some degree. And, I said to him, I was like, look, I've got ideas. Like, I think you just need to sit down with me. And like, I've got some ideas on how I think that you can fix some of these things, like, God, these guys can't go and take a shit without asking for permission first. And then you put them in the transition unit, and now they're expected to be civilians and like make decisions for themselves and do all of these things. And I said, I think there needs to be like the programming needs to change a bit in the transition unit. And he's like, yeah, budgets, this, that we do have programming, they don't all do it. And I was like, well, why don't you just make them do it? Well, we can't. I was like, but you can make them do all those other things. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But anyway, one of the things that I said to him was, look, there's 1% of the population who join the military who are going to do it for life. Maybe 1%. I was like, why aren't you talking about, transferable skills and life after military and whatever from basic training? Like, help these 18-year-olds understand how they can take their military career into being productive civilians after the fact. And yeah, sure, you're still going to have training accidents. You're still going to have, bad knees and terrible backs. But, help them think about what that transition might look like for them so that they're not 18 years in like John was and all of a sudden going, oh shit, now what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to feed my kids? And I said, and also like, why isn't mental wellness a discussion from the first day? Like, why aren't you training them with good coping skills and, all of these things? Instead, it's good job, boys. Way to train hard today. Let's all go grab a beer at the pub. Sure, we all grab a beer after work, no problem. It's a very North American, it's really a very global thing to do. But, we know that mental wellness is an issue within the military, particularly for those who go on to deployments and whatever else. And so why aren't we training for that in order to get the longevity that we need out of them also as soldiers? Anyway, they haven't started it, so clearly it fell on deaf ears. But
well, I've talked about this in the fire service as well. Now that we know in the mental health space, in the psychology, psychiatry, etc., that a large percentage of us who put on a uniform have got stuff in our early life. And I say stuff because it doesn't A, have to be all bad. And then B, I truly believe if it's addressed, that becomes a strength. That really does.
Mhm.
It's like that, fixing Japanese pottery with the gold glue. I think it adds to your empathy, your resilience, all the things that we need to be great in the military and the first responder professions. So why are we not having a conversation at the front door saying the fact that you're all here, you've probably been through some shit. And we're going to take that from a bad thing to a good thing. And we're going to start, working through whatever it is. And you can come in and talk about, the Bruins, or we can talk about your creepy uncle who molested you when you were 8. And obviously maybe you wouldn't present it in quite that way, but we'll start the conversation. And then in the same way that you do PT as a new firefighter, a new police officer, whatever it is, it'd be a mental PT. And you frame it in a way, because when we process this thing, you will be able to operate at a higher level. You will be able to search that 8th-story apartment building and find that child who's hiding under the bed. You'll be able to be in a flow state during a gunfight, whatever it is. So we're doing this to PT your mind. And I think if you frame that at the front door, that's how you remove stigma, because you take it from the broken individual to forging performance.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that.
I'd love to expand on your perspective when it comes to the financial side. I mean, obviously, you worked in healthcare yourself. If you were queen for a day, how do we package the message to actually get people to start proactively investing in their people and show the financial benefit as well?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? Everybody's been trying to figure that one out for a decade. And if I can come up with it in this podcast, I really hope I get paid for it. But
I'll send you a t-shirt.
Yeah, please. I think, I think one of the things that we have to start packaging it through is the impact on the community. And, it's easy to talk about, or it's a lot of focus is on, the impact on the individual family impacted by these situations, or the impact on the individual going through it, or the impact on the dollars that are spent as a result of death from suicide. But we don't really talk about what it means from a community perspective. And what I mean by that is, right now we have a shortage in the military, right? They're having recruitment issues also. They're trying to figure out how they do that. And if we're not keeping people strong in the military, in fire, in policing, paramedics, et cetera, all of the branches, then we risk going into a chaos state. And, with where the world is at, with the ability to get goods faster, easier, and by goods, I don't necessarily mean good goods, I mean bad goods. Having those services in place is so important. We look at the homeless crisis, and we've got it here. I know California's got it bad. I don't know how bad it is in Florida, although I do go to Florida, but I don't see it as often. So maybe you guys have it figured out. I don't know.
No, I think it tend to be more the densely populated cities, like the city of Gainesville, for example, up the road from me. If you go there's still a lot of homelessness. So I think they just tend to be ushered away from certain areas. I don't think it's even better specifically.
Yeah, that's what I expected. But so, we have a homeless crisis, and why is that? Some of it is mental health related. Some of it is, addictions related, which probably stems from a mental health illness. And so I think when you start thinking about the community impact that we're having, it's not just about the individual lives that we're losing, although important. But from a financial lens, when we start to think about the community impact, the increase in we call it welfare up here, Uh, and the increase in crime, the increase in drug usage in the black market or the gray market, um, you know, all of those things that now start to become an issue also have a profound financial effect on both the day-to-day citizens, but also the nation as a whole. And so when you start to add up those dollars, it becomes an extremely easy conversation to have, in that, this amount of money that needs to be invested in, mental health, healthcare, or whatever. Let's use mental health, healthcare as sort of the umbrella. There's multiple facets within that, being, drug rehabilitation, psychology supports, whatever. Is now a drop in the bucket in comparison to the millions or billions of dollars that we're spending in, overtime for police, because we can't keep them on the benches because, they're out with PTSD, or they're quitting because they just don't see a life in it that they want. But now we've got an increased crime rate, so you have to have more police on the front lines to begin with. And then, and that's leading to different things. And then you've got these encampments that are going up in flames because the homeless crisis is so bad. And, they're cooking in tents in the middle of winter. And you have these people who are, potentially dying in these encampments because of these fires that start to happen. And you've got, fire and paramedics who all need to be on the front lines for that, but they're also short-staffed right now. So you start to think about these bigger community issues and tally it all together and really realize that the middle hub going out with all of these spokes to all of these different problems is mental health. And if we could just fix the problem instead of putting band-aids on the solution or on the symptoms, then the amount of money that we spend would be far less.
I've used that example. Another great analogy is the NHS in the UK, which I grew up with. And in the 70s and 80s, when I was tiny, it was amazing. And that was when it was fully funded and supported and hadn't been privatized yet, or partially privatized. But also the British people were healthy back then. And if you look at it today, partial privatization, the obesity epidemic has exploded in the UK. And, there's always this thing, oh, we need more money, we need more money. And I disagree. You need to make British people healthy again. So what are you serving in the schools? Are there still PE programs? All the kind of elements that contribute to this. What is your stance on all these fast food companies just, saturating your market? How can we get back to how we lived in the 70s and 80s? And once you free up all that money, well, there's your money to support all the other things that you need. So it's not about, and America is obviously even worse because we are 73% obese or overweight now. I think it's 43 clinically obese, 43%. So there's your money. You make Americans healthy again. I think someone told me the other day that our healthcare is 20% of our GDP. So we don't need any more money. The money is there. It's just proactively investing. And if we bolstered PE programs and sport programs, not only in schools, but in communities where you didn't have to spend $100 to rent a field for your kids to play, and you put real food back in schools, and you pedestrianize downtowns and work more on public transport and all these other things, you would turn everything around, and there is your money. You look at the way Portugal decriminalized addiction. They took the money on the failed war on drugs and they put it into addiction counseling, mental health counseling, job creation, housing. And in 8 years, they turned theirs from the worst to the best in either Europe or the world. I still need to look that up. But incredible turnaround. So it's not about more money. More money to pay for the same shit that you're doing isn't going to fix anything. But you take the money that you're bleeding and you put it at the front and you invest, as you said, in these proactive preventative programs. Then you have all that money downstream that you're not wasting anymore, that you can put and amplify your solutions.
Well, I think it's interesting because in the Canadian market, we have universal healthcare up here, and so it's free. but it isn't necessarily, well, first of all, people don't understand how much tax we pay to go to our healthcare. But that's an accountant question for a different day. But one of the things that strikes me as odd is mental healthcare is not free.
Really?
No. So there are small, short programs that you can do. So, for instance, I had a difficult time a couple of years ago through burnout at work and dealing with my brother, and my father-in-law just passed, and I had just basically reached my breaking point and had a call with my family GP, and she's like, "I'm sending you a letter. I'm sending a summary of your chart. You need to go to Emerge. Like, we have to get you in with a mental health care specialist. And the fastest way to do that is to go through emergency." So off I went through emergency, sat there for 5 hours. And by that point, I had cried for so long that I was just exhausted. And they're like, "Well, you can sit here for another 3 more hours and, maybe talk to somebody, maybe. Or you can take this green piece of paper and come back tomorrow." And I was like, "I'm taking the green piece of paper and I'm coming back tomorrow." I had my husband with me. They knew that I was safe. There was no issues that way. But, as I'm about ready to leave, "Would you like an Ativan?" It's like, "No, I'm good, man." Like, that's
A
not going to help
roadie?
me. Yeah, like, and it's done with the best of intentions, but like they just can't help you. And so then I got into this program at the hospital to help with coping skills and stress management. But it's a defined, 3 or 4 sessions. And then you can maybe get yourself into another program, but you have to see the psychologist first, and you get to see him once for free. But then after that, because you've gone through emergency, but then after that, it's not free. And, up here, it's a psychologist or a psychiatrist will run you on average probably about $250, $275 an hour. And who has money for that after all the tax we pay to pay for our healthcare system?
Absolutely.
And so, it's very frustrating to me when we talk about, healthcare, and, we're spending so much money on healthcare and we need more money for healthcare, when many of the issues, including obesity, stem from mental health challenges, but we're not addressing any of that as part of our healthcare. And, it's not something that we do. "Oh, you're feeling sad today? Here, take some, SSRIs." That's it. That's the extent of our mental health healthcare. And I think that it's such a miss when we know that so many problems, anxiety, depression, all of those things are all big contributors to employee productivity issues and substance abuse. So, like, it's an easy conversation, and I don't understand why nobody else gets it.
Well, and there are models where all these things have worked. Like the NHS, again, don't look at 2026, but when it was fully supported, was, I would argue, the best healthcare system on the planet. All of us are going to stay healthy so that anyone who needs help, we're going to chip in. You're all going to get help, because one day it'll be our turn. If you're worried about turns, you'll be old. You'll get hit by a bus once if you want your value for money. But I'd rather be healthy and help other people personally. But yeah, so when people are pregnant, when God forbid they do get cancer or they do have a nasty accident or they're just simply, end of life, that we'll take care of you. That's the ultimate, it takes a village model, and it's beautiful. And if you look at places that have done it, going back to Portugal, people go, "Oh, well, but drug users are criminals." Like, well, no, addicts are, it's a mental health issue. And if they commit other crimes, then yeah, that's a crime. If they beat someone up and steal their purse, separate conversation. But what happened in Portugal is by putting their addiction into the hands of the mental health, the medical community. Now, what do you think that did for law enforcement? All of a sudden, there's all this time now for their police to chase the dealers and the smugglers and the child, sex abusers and all the people that our police should be pursuing, rather than if you
Yeah.
look at Cops in the 90s, a TV show, car chase, beating them up, and then like, look, see, there was some marijuana. That's how it used to be, and that's
Yeah.
taxpayers' money. So when you put it in the right area, all of a sudden, like you said, it frees up all these resources for other things. And now you're doubling down on the things that actually need to be addressed. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there's a great story Johan Hari wrote about in Chasing the Scream, and I'll kind of summarize it. They did an IV study on obesity. So they gave all these subjects just IV nutrition. And they had this one woman, I think her name was Amy, who was a rock star of the group. And she lost the most weight. And then one day she just disappeared. And they finally tracked her down, and she'd started eating again and ballooned. And one of the researchers was astute and said, sat her down and said, well, when did you start? When do you remember starting to eat the way that you did? Like, oh, I was about 11. And he said, was there anything significant that happened to you when you were 11? And she said, yeah, that's when my grandfather started sexually abusing me. So psychologically, she got to the point where she was slim, had started getting attention of the opposite sex again, and it put up the fight or flight response, and she didn't want that. So she ate to remove that. So, and then we all know, obviously, the dopamine hits and all that stuff when it comes to the fast food is engineered to prey on that. So I couldn't agree more. Even the obesity crisis is partly, the mental health crisis, and obviously the environment too. If you got no activity and fast food everywhere, of course, you're a product of your environment. If we can change that environment too and address the mental health side, you would save trillions of dollars.
Well, and I think, look at I don't know what the US is doing right now. I don't pay that close of attention because who knows what kind of information you're getting on the news these days. But, we've got this carbon tax up here on fuel and things, or we've had it. They've decreased it or gotten rid of it finally now. But we had this massive carbon tax up here because, we were going to save the planet with it. And but we don't have a fast food tax. But think about the money that you could generate for the healthcare system to deal with eating issues and, addiction issues and whatever else. If you started taxing, unhealthy fast foods and whatever, they would have to come up with some calculation for that, I'm sure. But start taxing unhealthy fast foods so that fast food is now not cheaper than an apple. Like, why is a Big Mac cheaper than an apple? Somebody explain it.
I don't think it is anymore. I think there's been a shift. I mean, now if you go to a fast food place and try and feed a family of 4 and then go to the grocery store, I guarantee you could feed your family cheaper at the grocery store now, which is a great thing.
It is a great thing. But the problem is it wasn't for so long. No. And now we're all addicted to it. But if we continue to make it more expensive, eventually you have to drive people back. And so I think that's where I think that's a miss, right? Like, let's start, if we're going to have these governments, particularly here, who are going to tax people into the behaviors that they want them to have, like, this is one that we need to think about. We need to be eating healthy. We need to be, exercising. And I need to do that more too myself. I'm really great up here on my pedestal, but we need to be doing those things and then taking that money and using it for the betterment of the mental health of our people, because ultimately that is going to make our community stronger.
Absolutely. Well, I want to kind of go back to November 22nd, 2021. Walk me through how you now were able to navigate that grief. And I'm sure it's not over yet by any means, but, start to trying to get around that yourself. And then how did that lead to Operation Talk to Me, Johnny?
Yeah. It was a Monday. It started like any other day. I was crazy busy with work, and back in those days, my husband and I are both professionals. We put all of our eggs into our work basket. We don't have any kids, but and so, we work a lot. We work 70, 80 hours a week, and it really drove our life. And I can remember leading up to the 22nd having these nightmares that actually my father passed away. And, we hadn't been to see them in, a couple of months. And, how dare I, basically this guilt that had come up because, I lost this person because I hadn't prioritized them in my life. And so, it was kind of unsettling. But, my parents were always very supportive of my career. So I just sort of kept doing what I was doing. And I realized now it was a bit of a warning. And I wish I had have listened to it a bit more, but can't. Hindsight is what it is. And so I spoke to my parents. I was having some sort of inner ear infection and had to go to the doctors, but I was trying to work and do all of these things because we had this big restructuring that was coming up, and I was front and center in all of that. And so I spoke to my dad that evening, gave him the update on how I was feeling, went to bed early that night. And because I was so stressed out and getting so burnt out with work, I actually had my phone on that do not disturb bedtime feature, and which I loved back in the day, and now I refuse to use ever again because my parents called me, but they called me from different phones. So at midnight, my parents started calling me after the OPP had shown up to give them the news, and Dad called me and then Mom called me, but because the same number didn't call back to back, it didn't come through. And had it not gone to my watch, I wouldn't have even gotten the call at all. And so I remember looking at my watch and being like, Dad's calling, and then seeing the time and knowing immediately, my throat, my gut just lurched. I knew that something was terribly wrong. And I was like, holy shit, this dream is coming true. Something has happened to one of my parents. And so I got on the phone and I immediately didn't say hello, didn't say anything. It was, Dad, what's wrong? And he said, your brother hung himself. And I was like, what the fuck? And I just screamed. And my poor husband jumps out of bed, having no fucking idea what's going on. Sorry, I hope I'm allowed to swear.
No, you are.
And, and whatever. And so my dad's like, is Tom awake? And I was like, yeah, he just woke up. And he's like, give him the phone. And I was okay. And I was just in this state of shock and complete disbelief. I couldn't figure out if I was just having, the worst nightmare of my life or if I was actually going through this. And so Dad got on the phone with Tom and, explained to Tom what had happened and told him just take care of her, just take care of her. And Tom's like, yep, no problem, John, don't worry about it. And my dad's name is also John. And so they got off the phone and we just sat there and I couldn't breathe. And so my husband just kind of hugged me for a few minutes until I could, catch my breath and kind of come back to my body a little bit. And he finally looked at me and thank God, he's like, should we get packed? And I was like, oh yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to sit here. And so, we got up, we got packed and put through a bunch of stuff in duffel bags, and we were out the door. And at that point, I was living in Toronto and my parents were about 3 hours away. And so we finally arrived at their place about 4:00 in the morning. And I remember pulling in and every light in the house is on. And Mom and Dad are just sitting on the couch and they had decorated for Christmas. They had just decorated for Christmas that day. And so you walk in and the stockings are all hung up and the Christmas tree is lit up and, whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, that. And so anyway, we sat there and we really didn't say much at all. We gave each other hugs, of course, and cried and whatever, and just sort of sat there for a few minutes. And then the phone rang. And it was organ donation calling to find out if we wanted to they couldn't take his organs, but they wanted to know if they could have, I don't know, his skin and something else. And so mom's like, absolutely not. And so I was like, okay, I'll call you back. Like, let me call you back. So anyway, we got off the phone with them, sat my mom down, had a conversation, and she was like, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I was like, okay, no problem. You can't do it. Fine. And so they called back a few minutes later and said, like, sorry, but we have to make this decision now. And I was like, yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go through with this, which is like such a surreal conversation to be having when only 3 hours before that you found out that, your brother is gone, right? And now you're trying to talk to your parents about whether or not they're comfortable with donating any part of his body to research. And and in that moment, watching my parents break like that in a way that I had never seen. They had both lost their parents already. And so I had seen those vulnerable moments growing up with them. But to watch my parents break in this way that I could never imagine was the worst feeling of my life. And so, we all just kind of sat there and it was like, okay, who do we need to call? Well, we need to call his lawyer because, we need to get a few things figured out that way because he was still battling with his ex-wife. We need to call, family responsibility office because that's who she wanted to go through for the child support payments, and ask them to please not take that out of his bank account because there won't be any money going in. And, we need to call the base and we need to let them know. And, starting to make this list of like who we have to get in contact with. And so, you have to kind of sit there and wait for an appropriate hour because everything's really important to you, but nobody else gives a shit at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so finally at 8 o'clock, I called the base and, talked to a couple of really very friendly people. But they don't know what to do with that information. It doesn't typically come to them that way. And so our situation and our experience was extremely unique, not in a good way. And I actually had to call the base 3 times to tell them that my brother had passed before we got any action happening. And it was really a frustrating moment, and one of those moments where I think it helped lead me to some understanding of what he was dealing with because, he was trying to get that help. He kept going in and asking for referrals to get help, and he kept sort of getting the runaround. And that's kind of what I got when I was trying to notify them of his death. And, I don't blame any of the guys over there. I've spoken with many of them since then. But it was just a shit show. And called everybody else that we needed to call. And then of course people just started converging on the house. And, we had to go over at 9 o'clock after the kids had gone to school, and knock on his ex-wife's door and let her know that her children's father had passed away. And, it was one of those situations where, she didn't really like us and we weren't exactly friendly with her. And so it was, you need to know this. We want to support the boys how we can, but also you're going to have to keep some distance here because now feelings are really raw and we don't want anything happening that we can't take back later on. And so she thankfully respected that. And my mom and I went over later that afternoon and sat with her and her parents. And the boys came in off the school bus, and his oldest son, who's so much like him, comes in and goes, "Who died?" Like, oh shit. And so anyway, we asked them all to come over and sit down with us. And we told them that their father had passed away. And I can just remember one of them taking off like a shot in the other direction into his bedroom, slamming the door. All of their reactions were so unique. And it was absolutely gut-wrenching. Probably one of the hardest conversations I've had to have. And so we sat with the boys for as long as we could, and then, went home. And the next day we drove up to Owen Sound, where he was based at the time, and because we needed to get his clothes and things for the funeral home. And so started to gather those things up, and a lot of his buddies were already at the house. They had cleaned up most things so that we didn't see any of that. And started to pull some things together for us that they knew that we would need, and started pulling some things together for his kids, hat badges and cat badges and things like that, so that they could make sure that they had enough for all four of them and things of that nature. And I can remember sitting in his house and just sitting there and having this like really heavy feeling, that was so much heavier in that particular space than it had been sort of leading up to it. And, we're all sort of bickering at each other, and nobody's really knows what they want to do, but everybody knows they want to do something, and nobody can figure out what it's going to be. And it was one of the few times where, everybody was sort of bumping heads a little bit in my family. And, usually there's one or two, but there's never like everybody's sort of, in this moment. And finally we all kind of sat down and called each other on our shit. And, and it was like, no, like we need to stick together through this. Like that's the only way that we're going to survive this in any sort of way. And so we did. And, I went with my parents and his fiance to the funeral home, and we made the arrangements. And finally, a day later, the military showed up and was like, so we're going to start making the arrangements. And we're like, you're too late. We're done. Like it's Saturday. like, and I couldn't believe it, because they come in, they infiltrate your house. There's like 5 of them. And you've got the padre, and then you've got the designated assistant, which is the civilian conduit, basically, for everything death related. And, an RSM and somebody else, whatever, all come in, they sit at your kitchen table with you. They start to talk through the process. And then they're like, oh, like you've already done everything. And we're like, yep. And they're like, okay. And so then they take a look at the obituary that I did, and they're like, oh, you're going to have to change this wording. It's not technically correct. It's like, technically correct to who? Like, God. They're like, well, this means something different in the military. And I was like, but it's mostly civilians who are going to read this. So like, and anyway, they changed the obituary. I couldn't believe it. And to suit the like military proper wording, which to some degree I get now, but also like in that very, very dark hour, like really?
Mm-hmm. Was it that important?
You couldn't just let that one go today, could you? Like, especially since, I'm sorry, but I don't know what happened at your guys' end, but you screwed this all up to begin with. You're 2 days late and $1 short, guys. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And so anyway, later grew to like understand their roles a little bit better, relaxed a little bit, but there was a lot of anger in those first couple days. And, and we got through the visitation. And for me, it was one of those things where as you're going through it, you're standing there. It's like most, visitation receiving lines. You're kind of numb. You're just shaking hands. I did it with my grandparents and whatever. But then certain faces would, obviously bring up more challenges. For us, the issue was we didn't recognize a lot of the faces because we didn't know who John worked with. And he really kept that piece of himself very quiet, and, really separated the two things. So this was home life and this was military life, and never shall the two meet. I laugh because some of the guys even today are like, oh, we didn't even know John had a sister. Like,
thanks.
And, but, all of a sudden these guys show up, and they're shaking hands with my brother, who was just before me in the receiving line, my youngest brother. And And they're like, oh yeah, we're, so and so and whatever. And, we work out in Alberta, but we worked with John in the military and now we're in wind energy and whatever else. And I was like, excuse me? And they're like, oh yeah, like we work in Alberta. And I was like, but you live here? And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, so you hopped a flight from Alberta last minute to come to a 30-minute visitation? Because it was COVID, so you had 30-minute slots. And they were like, yeah. And I was like, okay. Like, I was like, well, you're here, so you might as well stay for the funeral tomorrow. And they're like, oh, no, like we can't. We got a flight at 4:00, so we'll never make it if we come for the funeral. And because we didn't have the funeral posted because we had number restrictions, so nobody knew when the funeral was. And so anyway, I'm giving the eulogy the next day. And as I start to give the eulogy, these 3 guys walk in. So they had changed their flights back to Alberta in order to be there for the funeral. And so, of course, we had gotten to our max on numbers in the funeral home. And my youngest nephew and I walk out first because he was carrying the cap and the medals that my brother had, and out to start the funeral procession. And as I got outside, there was all of these reserve individuals from Owen Sound who had come down and were standing outside waiting to go to the cemetery. And I was just like, what? So we went to the cemetery, and then they do this thing at the cemetery where, in order of rank, they salute before they leave the gravesite. There were so many of them. So we stood there and watched that for a few minutes in the warmth of the car, and before we went over for the luncheon. But, it was one of those things where as you're going through it and you're starting to meet all of these people that you didn't know even existed a week earlier, and having these conversations with them about John and about the influence that he had on their life, and about, how his death was impacting them and things like that. You really started to understand the dynamic and the brother and sisterhood that is the military, that is so unique to, military, police, fire. Like, we don't, I'll go for a beer with the people that I work with, but, I'm not, and I would be sad if they passed away, but it's not going to have the same impact to me as a civilian that it seems to have in these other scenarios. And so as I was going through, post John dying, I was just looking for some way to stay connected with him. And because I couldn't now connect with him as a family member anymore, because he wasn't there to sort of run things past and, whatever, I got drawn to this side of him that I never got to really experience, which was the military side. And so to this day, I stay in touch with some of his best friends from the military. We'd randomly text each other, or, we'll meet up for coffee or do whatever. But because of that, I started following certain people on the internet, and then that led me to following other people on the internet. And one of the groups that I started following was All Okay out of Ottawa. So Matt Russell is RCR, our former RCR now, he just retired. And him and his wife Fadi started this awareness brand, really. And in February, they've historically done a 22 push-up challenge on February 22nd. And so I found out about this through somebody and was like, oh, okay, well, I can't do 22 push-ups, but I'm going to try to do 22 push-ups. And John died on the 22nd, so 22 is really an important number for me. And then I learned why it's 22 push-ups, and that's because the number of military who are presumed to die by suicide on a daily basis, although we're pretty sure the number is significantly higher than this now in the US is 22 a day. And so I was like, okay, now I know this, plus 22 is important because of John. And, this was going to be the 15-month, anniversary of, or Memorial Day or whatever. And so I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I can do 22 push-ups for 22 days. And I'm going to put a song and a story to every single day. So I can't do 22 push-ups. And if anybody can find them on my personal Instagram, they are bad. They are very bad. But for 22 days, I followed through with this plan, and, I started having people follow me and reach out to me, make sure that I was okay. And then I had this guy who's former military and police on the East Coast start taking the same song that I chose and doing his push-ups to that song also. And so for 22 days, I really started to feel a connection in this community of, first responders and veterans who are all trying to spread the same message about mental wellness. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I started meeting up with some of them because, that's super safe to do, meet up with people that you meet on the internet. But, they're all cops and firefighters, so it's got to be fine,
What could
right?
possibly go wrong?
That's right. And that's when I got the idea that, my parents and I should do something bigger. That's what John would have done. He would have helped people. And so how could we do the same thing? And so in May of 2023, we officially launched Operation Talk to Me Johnny. So Talk to Me Johnny comes from a article that was written by a gentleman by the name of Jay LaJoy, who worked with John, actually served with him up here in the Canadian military, but he writes for the Havoc Journal in the US. And he wrote a story in January of 2022 about John's death and, how he sort of felt about it and whatever. And it was extremely impactful to me that somebody would do this. And the title of the article is Talk to Me, Johnny, which is a Rambo reference. For most people catch that. But for those who don't know, it's a Rambo reference. And so it seemed perfect for the name of the organization. And so we started Operation Talk to Me Johnny in November of 2023, which would have been his 2-year memorial. We did a ruck march, and it was really important that this first event that we did really represented John. And so we rucked from the Sarnia Armories here in Ontario to the Wyoming, Ontario Cemetery, with the Sarnia Armories being the place that John wrote his entrance exams for the military, and the cemetery being where he's buried. So a sort of nod to how his career started and how it ended. And we were so fortunate to have a ton of family support and some really good community support. And we were able to get 78 people to walk the full 24.5 kilometers with us. We had a few more join us at the last stop and do about 5 or 6 with us. And we raised $15,000 for a couple of partners, veterans and everyday heroes up here who help get service dogs for veterans and first responders, and another charitable organization in Manitoba called Forging Ahead, who does metalwork as like an artistic outlet for PTSD. So the overwhelming support was, okay, like, yes, we need to do this. We need to formalize this. And so we did. We formalized it into a nonprofit organization that year, and have since started doing community family-friendly events. So last year was our first year. We're planning for May of this year, but it's a sort of like a family fun day where you can come out. There's you know, all the first responders are there. Hopefully I can get the military there this year. And so you can interact with all of these individuals well in their uniforms, but really in this like fun setting, hoping to bring some of the humanity of these individuals to the day. We're hoping to have a wellness tent this year where you can do yoga and meditation and learn to do some of these things that are good coping skills. And then we've got a lot of organizations that come out either that are veteran or first responder businesses, or that support veteran or first responder businesses and mental wellness that come out. And so we've got a bunch of vendors out, and then, you know, nothing's complete without a bouncy castle and, you know, a giant slide and things like that. And then we cap the afternoon off with an obstacle course. And so this is sort of my nod to the dark humor of all of, you know, first responder and veteran organizations. And so there's a physical piece, and then a piece that sort of makes fun of each of the groups. So the military person in this obstacle course has to go under like a netting and do like an army crawl. And then they have to jump up, run to a hula hoop, and shine their shoes. You know, the cop has to write a ticket and eat a donut. The firefighter has to run with a fire hose, which we were grateful to have a couple donated to us. And then, you know, strike a pose for the firefighter calendar, things like that, right? So it's all meant to be in fun, but keep it, you know, physical in some sort of challenge. And then they run about a quarter of a mile or a half mile, somewhere in between there. But when you get across the line, you actually have to do like jumping jacks until everybody's across the line. So there's that element of no one being left behind, even though there can still be sort of a front runner. So of course the team with all 4 people across the line first get a prize and all of that. But we had a few of the officers participate with us last year, and it was a lot of fun. So really looking forward to seeing what we can do with that. And the reason we wanted it to be community oriented after the first event was because of John's sons, and really making sure that, you know, we're getting kids involved as early as possible in the mental wellness conversation, but not at a level where, you know, you're sitting down with them at the table and having this really heavy conversation about mental wellness. Like, let's start making it a part of a 3-year-old's vocabulary because they had a really fun day at this event one time. And so how do you do that? And, you know, as I said to you, I don't know if we can break the stigma in my lifetime. I hope so, but I also know how slowly things like that can move. And so I do have high hopes that we can do it in my nephew's lifetime. And I think, or I hope, that events like the one that we plan on May 30th of this year will start to do that.
Well, it sounds amazing. It really does. And it's really interesting seeing over and over again these grief stories, how they do spawn, I'm going to do something about it. And I've always said the way that we honor the people that we lose, because no one's invented a time machine yet to go save their life, is we fight to fix whatever the thing was that took them from us. It's that simple. So I love, you know, the healing element of trying to address, you know, the issue and trying to do something in the memory of someone that we've lost. And I think this is amazing. For people listening, where can they find Operation Talk to Me Johnny online?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on most social medias. I'm not on TikTok yet because I don't understand that one as well. But, you know, I'm older, so I grew up in the 80s. So Facebook, of course. We're on Instagram. And then you can go to our website, opt2mj.com, and check us out there and stay in touch with some of the things that we're doing. And of course, email optalk2 me, Johnny, at gmail.com.
Brilliant. Are there any other places if people want to reach out to you specifically?
I'm always happy to get a text. And so, they're welcome to reach out by email or Facebook Messenger. And, always happy to share or collaborate with anybody in whatever way is going to support the mission.
Beautiful. Well, Lisa, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation. I've always said I know that these conversations kind of rip the Band-Aid off and kind of reopen the wound for a moment. But I know there are so many people listening that this is going to resonate with, that it will save lives. There's no question. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.